panel with Eddy Zheng, founder and president of New Breath Foundation, and Lunar Project's own Yichen Feng. So I'm going to start with a question for Eddy. You have such a long history of organizing in API communities and building cross-racial solidarity between API communities and other communities of color. Can you share your story of how you started organizing and what that has looked like over time?
Thank you, Sabrina, and Yichen, the Lunar Project, for inviting me to share the space. Because we have an intimate group, and which I like, I like larger groups and I like intimate groups. The intimate group, we can have a conversation, right? Let's not be too formal and box ourselves in. Let's just have a conversation and sharing our experiences and our thoughts. For me, as someone who has been impacted by mass incarceration and deportation, I spent 21 years of my life growing up in the prison industrial complex. From an immigrant coming from China and not really understanding the language, culture, making the adjustment, I was quickly, started engaging in juvenile delinquency. As a result, eventually it led me to committed a crime against a family of 4 people in San Francisco, and with 2 of my friends, and I ended up being arrested and was convicted and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. And it was during the prison, when I was incarcerated, that I was able to learn how to read and write and start really learning how to, think critically, right, of my actions, having the language and the understanding of the harm that I inflicted, and then what I needed to do to rehabilitate myself and find purpose in life. And it was through that process that I was able to really immerse myself in learning, and I was able to tap into my chi. And you're going to hear me talk about that all the time. It's about how do I tap into that chi, right? It's not only the breath, but it's sustaining my life and our lives. The chi that I'm also talking about is culture, history, and identity. And it's because of that chi that some of the activism that happened, right, when I was in San Quentin State Prison, because myself and 2 of my friends, one is a Vietnamese American and one is a Filipino American, we advocated for Asian American studies and ethnic studies curriculums in the college program. And it's through that advocacy that I was starting seeing what it means to really be in solidarity with people in the community, even though we were isolated inside a total institution. And it was the people in the community, such as our ancestors like Yuri Kochiyama and many of the college students and community activists in the Asian American Pacific Islander community. They came together and they formed the Asian Prisoner Support Committee while we were in solitary confinement. And it's from there, that activism created a community and created a movement that frequently we don't see in the Asian American Pacific Islander community, right? And so historically, we can look at some of the ways the different movements are being formed. We can trace back to a lot of different ways of history, but some of the notable one would be, you see the 1968 Third World Liberation Front, right, in San Francisco State University, how people are coming together to really advocating for Asian American studies, ethnic studies, and global studies, right? Because they understood the importance of tapping into that chi, right? And then, we have, the injustice that happened, with the Japanese internment. We've seen the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and we've seen the 1982 Vincent Chin case. We've seen a lot of those different cases, but then really ignited the community to coming together. But in that process, I think that's where people find power and value in supporting each other and really addressing some of the inequity and injustice that's happening in our community. And so that's kind of led my journey into the understanding the importance of how do we build solidarity in our community. And just the other note I want to say what, you know, when I was incarcerated, because the AAPI community has a smaller percentage of impacted individual in comparison to the Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. We are categorized as other, and as part of the other, you know, we stuck with each other, but then we also find a lot of affinity with our, you know, African American brothers, right? So, you know, a lot of times you see a lot of people who are incarcerated. We always breaking bread together, you know, playing sports together, and just kind of building together in that way as part of the survival, right, together. And then it's through those type of learning that really I was able to really understand in historically how many of the Asian American leaders and our elders were leading by example, you know, in partnering with African American leaders or supporting them in their fight for liberation. And so coming back to the community, you know, and that's something that I was really grounded in, is how do we make sure, you know, as part of tapping into that chi, like it's not only about learning my own culture and history that inform my value and identity. It's how we also learning about other people's culture and history and their identity, you know, in this space. So I think that's what kind of led to my purpose and my investment in really focus on cross-cultural engagement, healing, and racial solidarity.
Thank you, Eddy. Yichen, tell us what inspired you to launch Lunar Project, and how does it build on other work you have done in community or funding or investing?
I want to also echo what Eddy said, in this being such a small group. So all feel free to just unmute yourself and, you know, ask questions or chime in with your perspectives too. And before I get started about Lunar Project, just want to thank you so much, Eddy, for being a leader in our community and for all the work that you do. Lunar is very, very proud and inspired and happy to be in solidarity with New Breath Foundation and you specifically as an individual. And just thank you for adding to the chi of our community, and hopefully our collective chi can together move forces to move the world in a way that benefits our people. And so I guess for me, it's just so wonderful to be here with you all. I am kind of representing Lunar a little bit in this webinar series too, and specifically for this event. But I just wanted to share a couple of stories for how Lunar and how I've come to this point in Lunar in my own journey of understanding who I am, my own cultural, racial identity, my journey as a just a girl trying to understand herself, and how I think there are all these words for like what roles we play, whether as activists or capital deployers or whatnot. But I still really just think of myself as a person just getting to know myself better and feeling how I can contribute to this world. It was my birthday a couple weeks ago, and a friend of mine who came to the celebration shared with me a memory that I had actually forgotten about a while ago. And the question was asked, like, you know, share a memory of Yichen. And I've known her since high school. And so her memory was how I put a display in the lobby of our high school when you walked in about the murder of Vincent Chin. And so the context is that I grew up in Los Angeles, a very, very multicultural community, largely of Latinx and Armenian folks. I was actually one of maybe like 2 Asian Americans in my high school. And so it was strange then. And it just like all these memories flooded back of how difficult it was to one, agitate the school administration to do something like that, because we just like didn't have that many folks who like, you know, care too much about Asian American history. But also where I was in my point in that life is that growing up in the community that I came from in LA, we learned a lot and our teachers were so wonderful in introducing us to Chicano history, and really like learning about the movements between like both like Mexicans and Mexican Americans at that time, learning about their acts of resistance, right, among people of Mexican descent, and how they've also kind of built power and learn and lean on the Black Power movement as well to embrace this sort of like Chicana identity and worldview. And so for me as an Asian American girl in school, I was like kind of curious about, you know, how does that relate to me? Like, I think I need to think more about what is Asian American history. And I like went on my own sort of journey of learning, of reading, of doing all of that. And then so that sort of culminated into this like display of like me wanting to share with my community a little bit about how Asian Americans have actually been part of the movement, but also in ways in which our communities have been activated too. And in a way, it's like, I just wanted to stand up and say like, I understand and can be in deeper solidarity with like former and current movements within the Latinx community, but also what can we bring and what can I bring from my own history that I want to share with like everybody else, right? And so as you all probably know, you know, we know more about all of these things within that movement space as it relates to the grape workers protests and the work between Larry Long and also Cesar Chavez. And so there sometimes is erasure in the leaders of like who these movements were. But I think when we look a little bit deeper, there's so much more evidence of cross-cultural power building than the dominant narrative may allow, right? And maybe the dominant narrative that is shaped by white supremacy that wants to remind us that our cultures are like pitted against each other, right? That the Chinese girl in class does well in school, but like no one else does or whatnot. But and part of, I think, my journey has been looking for these ways in which to move away from that and also integrate all these different parts of my identity and say, how can I be part of the movement? And so that all of that had sort of helped me start to ask these questions about, okay, this is one part of my identity. Like, what about these other parts of who I am and like how I engage with the world, which largely in our system of capitalism is like my day job, my work, right? And in my day job, I do work in the finance space. And so I've always carried these questions of like, how do I think about solidarity, cross-cultural power building, also rooted in my own sort of like theory and practice of breaking down white supremacy. And like with that, how do I bring it into the work that I do on a day-to-day basis, which is in the financial sector as an investor in education technology companies. It's not super inspiring from like a movement building narrative, but it has like given me a lot of questions around, so how does this like worldview of mine as it relates to sort of like solidarity and creating like a just economy, what does that mean? Because right now with money, I resource companies, but how can I also think about resourcing movement? It's like a different frame of mind for me, right? Like a movement is not a company. It's not transactional. Ideally, it's not transactional, right? Like I think maybe some folks here who have a lot more experience in philanthropy might say that that's one of the perils, right? And the traps that we can fall in. But ideally, we can resource movement from a longer, like in a longer, more consistent way. It's one of the goals of the Lunar Project, actually. Speaking of how we, Sabrina and myself, came to Lunar Project really as people from different professional backgrounds, philanthropy and private investments, but thinking about like resourcing movement in the long run and resourcing movement with an angle and a lens of solidarity, right? So in my day job, I think about resourcing companies, it's really very much in mind with like a financial return. Like how can I put $1 in and make $3 at the end of the day? Like very basic, you know? But what if as a financial institution, as Lunar, as some organization, as New Breath, right? We like engage with resource building and funding of organizations, of individuals, of communities from a longer term perspective. And I mean, I'll pause here, but the Lunar Project really is the answer to that for us. And it's a space that we're constantly exploring. Rebecca can attest, right? Like our decision-making processes are emergent. We're really trying to figure out a way of how do we cultivate the brilliance that has existed within giving circles historically, like things that the Asian American community, when so many of us from different diasporas came to the US, it was like the first way in which we were able to pull community capital and power, right? When banks would not lend to Chinese communities in Los Angeles, like the beneficial societies popped up, right? And all of that and all of the beauty of community resource building. We're trying to look at what insights can we come up from that if we did a giving circle in the modern day today, where our intention is to be in solidarity with Black and Indigenous communities at the Lunar Project. Like if we can do this and manage and deploy $100,000 with this vision and mission in mind, we should be able to do it with $20 million, $50 million, $100 million, whatever that like corpus ultimately is, right? And we also see Eddy and the work that you're doing with New Breath as like a sister brother sort of like comrade identity in how we can resource movements. And so I think us in conversation right now really is about like collective power together and how to, and like what are the opportunities that the collective power presents.
Thank you both. Eddy, I love the way that you always sort of tie in the spiritual, physical, and cultural into your work, and Yi-Chen also bringing in like the history and the histories that we stand upon in this work. So we started this session talking about our individual understanding of solidarity, and we know that both our individual and our collective understandings and practice of concepts like solidarity evolve over time with movements and in relationship with others and the work that we do. Can you each share how the work you do or have done in the past has shaped how you think about and practice solidarity as an organizer, a funder, or just as a community member, individual?
Okay, I can start. First of all, I kind of empathize with Yi-Chen. Like you, growing up, I'm always been comfortable with working with numbers, which is why I was a finance and accountant, a controller and CFO for a little over 20 years, and I can relate to that, and that's what actually empowered me in my old job, because I can analyze a company and tell them the break-even point or how we can maximize our profit or minimize the loss, and it's not until I got burnt out in that work, only because it's that work basically is what have you done for me lately, and it got old, and I felt like I wasn't contributing enough to the community that I live in. I grew up in San Francisco, and I always thought that I had a diverse group of friends where our ethnicity or the color of our skin was never really came into any discussion. So I was somewhat jaded growing up until I myself, was discriminated against, actually at my work, on my previous work, and that led me to volunteering and working with at BOSS, where I met Eddy, and at that time he was with the APSC, and he introduced me to Dorsey Nunn, who's the executive director of LSPC, and one thing led to another. I got the foot in the door, and I'm now a program manager. It's been about 6 years, and really it's like a blessing in disguise, where I was working in the communities that we serve, mostly the African American, but at the same token, I felt like I'm ignoring my own roots, where I came from, and this is one of the reasons why I kind of reached out to Eddy a few weeks ago, where I told him, how can I collaborate with APSC so that they see us more of a collaborator, and really create a solidarity movement, where the color of your skin shouldn't dictate who you are or what kind of opportunities is afforded us. And this is really where I want to be more involved, learn, and immerse myself, and how I can add value to the organizations that I can collaborate with, and obviously use my skill set to further improve their, their longevity, so that they have a staying power. And that's where I can contribute. And I came to realize I'm comfortable with working with numbers, so I shouldn't walk away from that, even though it kind of burned me out. But at the same token, I came to a realization that that's where I can contribute, is work with the organizations where I can step in and create a budget on how they can be sustain their operation. And I think that's where each one of us can should realize.
Yeah, Errol, thank you for sharing that, because this is something that I definitely align with, right? It's the opportunity to really, like what Yi-Chen said earlier, is how do I discover myself, right? Where do I fit in this space? And for me, it's definitely about how we are continue to reinventing ourselves, and the way that we invent ourselves is continue to engage our community, the different diverse communities, to continue to learn about the different ways that how we are all impacted by this idea that we should be separated. Right? That's the deserving and the undeserving, right? And so as part of that, it's really we have to identify the root cause, right? No matter how we try to avoid it, it is still imperialism, it's still white supremacy, right? It's still the institutional racism that essentially has been really divest in educating our community, investing in our social safety net, for many of our communities who has historically been disenfranchised and oppressed, right? And so part of that colonization of the mind is what continue to separate us, and not allowing us to come together and humanize each other. Right? I think that's why in the work that I do, I'm always trying to be mindful of how am I, when I'm showing up, how am I make sure that I understand what's going on with me, right? And where do I come from and how do I get here? And not forgetting is the people from diverse community who supported me, right? And to allow me the opportunity to make changes, to find myself, to find my purpose, so that I can continue to utilize my lived experience and hopefully to dispel, the model minority myth, and then also to validate that we all have different challenges, but then we share more in common than our differences in this space. And so I'm interested in really hearing from Yi-Chen and see how you are able to kind of navigate this space and what inform you, as you continue not only with the Lunar Project, but then just in your workspace, right? Because sometimes I always share with people in whatever space they're in, whether it's philanthropy, government, anywhere that's a position of power, is that how do we, if you're there, what you're doing, then it's about infiltrating and not assimilating, right?
Exactly.
And so are you able to do that in the financial world?
It's a great question. Sabrina and I were talking with Mario from Justice Funders many, many moons ago, and something he said that really stuck out. And I love this framing, which is that, somewhat of the nonprofit industrial complex has made it such that, activism is like a day job for some people, and it sort of separates like us as individuals, in our day-to-day lives, works, etc., feeling like, oh, maybe we're not activists because we don't do it as like a full-time job, right? But the reality is, like, we need people wherever in all of the spaces that we're in to like agitate. And I learned a lot about this specific concept from my partner, who is like almost a professional organizer, agitator in these like spaces. And I always think back about how I feel like a lot of lost opportunities in my life were when I was in spaces and I felt like I couldn't change it. But the reality is, what I should have thought about was like, how do I organize other people like in the space that I'm in to challenge, to request something, to maybe also poke them and make them think about like this question of solidarity, like what does that mean, right? But coming back to your question, Eddy, and specifically on solidarity, I really think that trying to be in solidarity in whatever that means for you in your life, and I'll say like in my life, has really been a provocateur of evolution for me. It's almost like when I take a step forward, I like can't really go back to what it was before. And one very specific example that relates to my work life as an ed tech investor is when I started, before I was investing, I was in investment banking, and you're more of like an advisor. So you like advise a bunch of different companies, but you're not actually like writing checks to invest in companies. And so when I moved to the advisory side, I told myself that one thing I really wanted to do was to better understand the actual experiences of people who would be engaging with or impacted by whatever company that I like invested in, right? So if you're a tool that supports teachers, I want to understand and meet the teachers that are actually using your tool to see if like they like the experience or not. So that was always really important to me to really understand like the user. And as that part of my journey evolved in 2019, so I started investing in 2018 in the middle of the year, there was a gigantic like nationwide teacher strike that kind of started. I don't know if y'all remember, but in West Virginia it was really big, in California, in Oakland, and Los Angeles. And as somebody who grew up in LAUSD, as I mentioned to you all earlier, it was important to me, and like my firm's mandate, by the way, is to invest in companies that make the lives better for teachers, parents, and students, right? And so there's only so many things that you can invest in that are products. And then you also need system change too, right? And so as part of the teacher strike, like so much of it was like just asking for very basic things like wage increases, like having an available nurse or like mental health counselor at schools, you know, it's like super basic things. And so part of like this idea that I had in my head was, well, you know, I think there's a lot of different ways to define resource and capacity. Some of it is financial, but solidarity is like one great example where I can go stand and protest and be with the teachers that are like asking for all of these wage increases, right? And so I said, and I'm still in touch with many of my educators from high school. So I pinged them. They were like, oh, we're doing this rally at this time, and we would all go together. So I tried to organize other education investors to also join me, and basically got zero interest from everybody across the board, specifically because many of the funders of like sort of not necessarily private education, but some for-profit sort of like and charter schools and whatnot are like, you know, wealthy billionaires in the world who basically are investors in funds like mine. So it was just too much of a like political no to like go and stand in public support of, you know, public school teachers. So and the reality is, this is, I think, all of the incentives behind why it's like really difficult to do a little bit of this organizing. But for me, it was like a no-brainer. Like mentally, I said, well, my fund is trying to make the lives of teachers better. Clearly, this policy change will make the life of teachers better. I'm going to go stand in solidarity because this is really like all that I'm trying to do in my work. These two things are aligned. Like, so I can't, why should it be not okay for me to do this, right? And so that experience really started to make me move away from wanting to do investing that I currently do. And so I'm still a fundamental believer in experiences being really like eye-opening and changing for people. And I think for us at Lunar, Sabrina, please like chime in. Part of why we do a giving circle with 12 weeks and political education, that's so part of it. And I hope Rebecca has enjoyed that. Rebecca, please also feel free to chime in. Is because, and doing it together as a cohort is because we're trying to create experiences where folks can have like these transformational experiences with each other, learning about history together. And now we're in this space where we're trying to move towards solidarity actions too. And like, how do actions also become transformative spaces for us, right? And I think, so for me, this like protest, you know, the teacher strike was one very obvious, clear sort of like event. But everyday solidarity, something that someone talked about in our last like webinar, right, I think is also really beautiful, is like thinking about the ways in which we can practice everyday solidarity. And maybe it's not such a big nationwide movement, but it doesn't mean that it can't be transformational too.
Thank you both. The last question I had for you was actually around resource needs and how we're moving resources, which you have started to touch upon already. But if there's anything else you two or anyone else in the audience wants to add about what you see as the resource needs to truly facilitate cross-racial solidarity between Asian and Black and Indigenous communities. And really thinking about resources as financial, but also other types of resources, whether it be showing up in support of campaigns or other types of resources that we might have access to. So how are New Breath and Lunar Project meeting some of those needs? And or any other projects that folks who are in attendance want to speak to?
Yeah, well, for New Breath Foundation, I was very clear once I learned from many of the elders and many of the people who has been in philanthropy for decades, that I was clear once I learned that consistently in national philanthropy that only 0.3% or less of its dollars goes to support Asian American Pacific Islander communities. For me, that's unacceptable. And that data actually matched my experience as someone that work in nonprofits and always trying to cultivate funding, whether it's from city and county or private individuals or foundations. It is always very difficult to justify why there are needs in comparison to the other Black and brown communities, right? So that's always this lack of understanding of the needs of the individual or communities. And so for me, I'm being very unapologetically in funding by mobilizing resources and funding marginalized AAPI communities only, right? But part of that, not forgetting, the people that we are funding has to also be invested in racial solidarity as their value, right? Because even though as I'm seeing the inequity in philanthropy when it comes to resources for the AAPI community, the Black and brown community are not much better, right? And even though they may get 6% or 7% of the dollar, but that's 6%, which is unacceptable, right? But when we look at, people look at one of the latest report, right, that was shared to the Just Fund platform, is that when they did the survey, in the donor advisory fund, right, which is in the foundations world, the donor advisory fund, it has $115 billion sitting there, right? Well, can you imagine what we can do with that money to address some of the challenges in our community, and how much better of our society we could have been, right? And so for me, resourcing is one thing, you really address some of the inequity, but I think ultimately when we have to really look within ourselves and make sure that how what we do and what we do is connected to not just in performative ways, but then in really in showing up in our daily lives and practice, that our liberation are tied to each other, right? And so that's why I really appreciate and love the Lunar Project by really starting from the basics. It's culturally competent political education, right? To bring like-minded folks to come in and just share their lived experience and learning things that they may not have been exposed to, right? Or they have been exposed to that have not been really intentionally trying to really understand how we, even with those type of well intentions and what we wanted to do, that we need to continue to build community, and we need to continue to learn from each other and learn from other communities, right? And I think that type of relationship building and deepening of that understanding, right? I think it's important for us to continue to move forward. When we're talking about racial solidarity, while we'll be showing up for indigenous folks. I just want to share, lastly, is that there's plenty of resources out there. But if we continue to be conditioned with this scarcity mentality and thinking that, well, if you're doing your project, then you're in competition of my project or the other project, that is exactly why we continue to fail, right? And not being able to trying to work together and trying to move forward together. And instead of we're moving forward 1 or 2 steps, and we pull back 4 or 5 steps, and so that continues that cycle, right? And so for me, is how do I make sure to, as I'm creating a seat at the table of philanthropy, how do I start in creating our own table? How do we start creating access for all communities, right? Through the fact that we are having a seat at the table, right? So I think that's something that I want to be mindful of.
Thanks, Eddy. Yi-Chen or anyone else, any thoughts on resourcing solidarity?
Would welcome folks in the space to share. And hi Mari, hi Mathilde.
Hello everybody. Nice to be here. Sorry for being late. That's why I have been kept quiet, but learning a lot. Thank you very much.
Yes, Jonathan, go for it.
Yeah, I'm curious on the thoughts around the idea of movement capture. I think even as there is a need for like Asian Americans to get more resources in philanthropy, and the resourcing of the ideas of what does racial solidarity look like, there's a fact of like philanthropy kind of dictating kind of where resources go is making a power and a choice that sometimes isn't the best, or it doesn't have historical ways that it supports things. And even in like criminal reform, for example, like the Koch brothers or other entities say, oh, we want criminal reform and want it to look like this, but it doesn't really start at the stem at truly reforming. Or even Yi-Chen, as you mentioned about your ed tech, kind of, or ed investing, like it just connecting the values and what actually happens. So I wonder about what it looks like to, or it's something we wrestle with. I don't expect any answers, but I wonder in the idea of movement capture and philanthropy dollars, even as you mentioned that Black and brown communities have billions of dollars invested in them from outside sources. Are their conditions better because of it? Or is it just a way that it's been perpetuated or mediated to be quieted and not actually improved? So I'm curious what that looks like to wrestle with that as we talk about solidarity.
Yeah, Jonathan, I mean, I think, yeah, you're right. Right. And so there are a lot of different philanthropic institutions who say that that's what they're doing, but in actuality, they're not, because they're disconnected from what was really happening on the ground, right? Or with people, their needs. You brought up the Koch brothers. They profit off of people's lives, profit off people's sufferings. So what you can't say one breath I'm going to do support criminal justice reform, where much of my money is making from locking people up and having different policies that continue to discriminate against people of color, right? And so I think that's one piece. But then I think the other piece goes back to the hierarchy and the power of the super wealthy people using philanthropy as a money laundering machine, right? And so we have the nonprofit industry complex, but then we also have the philanthropy industry complex, right? With billions and billions of dollars just sitting there, right? Because they can do that by not paying tax, right? And so foundations like New Breath Foundation or projects like the Lunar Project, we start from zero, right? $0. Just start from a concept. Whereas other foundations come in that, you know what, I already got $300 million, so I'm going to start from ground zero with 300 million. That's their idea of ground zero. I'm going to start with 300 million and build it up. And I'm starting from zero and build it up, right? And trying to slowly dollar by dollar to build it up, right? And so that's a difference. And then another trend in philanthropy and that connects to the grantees and the community is that philanthropy was trying to get the talent from the community, because the idea is like, hey, we're disconnected. Obviously, we're disconnected. So it'd be good for us to get people who's been doing the work in the community to be in philanthropy. Well, that shifts the entire dynamic. And the reason why that shifts the dynamic is because you can get paid, and Aaron knows how much people get paid at LSPC, all of us none. If you getting paid maybe, I don't know, 60,000 a year, or maybe even 80,000 a year, right? All of a sudden you go to philanthropy, you get 150 or 250 a year, you got benefits and all of this. And then yes, your idea is like, I want to go in there to help support my community. But once you're in there, they neutralize you, right? Because you're still in a space where dominated white rich folks are still on the board dictating where the money go, how much money is going to go. And then, but you have the people of color represented as a buffer, right, to be able to determine, say, look, we hire people from this thing. But once you're in there, and that's why I emphasize the point about infiltrating and not assimilating, right? It's okay that you get a living wage finally. It's okay that you finally get for your value, for all your lived experience, that you're paying off your student loan, you're buying a house. That's great. You earn it, you deserve it, right? So that's not the point. The point is that there's this understanding of once you get sucked into that lifestyle, it can very easily, you can just become accustomed to it, right? Then you don't want to challenge the status quo, and so that's one thing. But you have leaders like the Crystal Haleen from the Libra Foundation, like the Carmen Rojas, in those type of spaces who are challenging philanthropy within philanthropy, right? And being very bold and go out there saying that this is how we should show up when we're talking about racial solidarity, and when we're talking about address some of the injustices happening historically in our community. I think that's why I shouldn't consider myself in, I don't know what type of generation I mean, but in the generations like the Sabrina, they're the present generation, right? To be able to move that forward and to model that for the next generations. And so this is how we have to continue to learn and grow in this type of spaces. And then I also want to say, lastly, I know we have a few minutes, I would say that, what Yi-Chen was talking about in the finance world and those type of investment world, and when we try to cultivate high net worth individual donors, they always looking at the term of return of investment, ROI. What's my ROI? Well, I think people always forgetting that ROI is actually making you feel good about having the privilege, the ability to give money, to support people. That is the ROI. It's not about what they're giving, what you're giving to them. It's what are they, the value that they are giving the individual who's giving the money, right? Because you're capable of doing that, right? So that is the ROI we need to think about, and not what, if I give you the money, what are you going to do with that money, and how you're going to get the return of investment, where we already know we're investing in human beings, and you can measure how much impact you can take all the time. Some you can, some of them you get that return of investment right away. You see the result right away. Others, it may not see it right away, right? But it's good for the soul, right? And I think that's where we need the people. And then, so when I give money to people, it's not like, hey, I'm going to give you this money, but it's like, hey, can I give you this money? Can I offer this money to you, right? Because I appreciate it if you take this money, right? Just because I got the money. And this is what we see the trend. People are throwing money around because of all the anti-Asian violence that's happening, or the Black Lives Matter and all this injustice that continue to happen. But because it's right now, it's right there, magnifying glass, and then people are just throwing money around, right? But then they throwing money around. Are you doing it intentionally to really get the money to the people on the ground who are doing the work and let them drive what you should be giving, or are you just continue to do that top down
In my world, we call that the white guilt tour of the last year. So, Sabrina, did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to open it up and just say that we have a couple of minutes left, and I invite any last comments or questions from folks, but go ahead, Yi-Chen.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think, Eddy, that's such a powerful point about wanting like to get folks excited about doing work in this way too, right? That starting from zero. And I mean, I think for what we see in the Lunar Project is really powerful opportunity for people power to come together, where we can do funding from this like more traditional raising $100 million fund things, or just somehow finding the wealth, or we can do it with a community of folks who have an intention come together. In our giving circle, folks donate anywhere between $5,000 to $10,000. It's still a lot, I would say. I think we all sort of recognize that it's a privilege to be able to pool funds like that together. But, you know, in the APIP larger giving circle network, there are many that have minimum $100 or checks or donations, right? So it can be really, really decentralized. And I feel like the power of the individual donor and like thinking about people power is really powerful. And it gets these larger institutions who maybe don't have thesis. Like they have money, but they don't have a thesis for how they want to give it out. I see this so much in the for-profit space too, where there are a lot of folks, high net worth individuals who became billionaires, suddenly want to run funds because it's a hot thing to do nowadays, right? But need to find people to figure out how to decide how to give the money away, or the organizations to give them away, because they don't have a thesis. And maybe that lack of thesis comes up for many different reasons. Maybe a lack of relationship to communities, right? Maybe a lack of like you were saying earlier, Eddy, like self-reflection for what's actually important. Like, how does this sudden windfall of capital play into an individual's own personal story, right? Because it's going to be different for everyone. I mean, we came to this space because solidarity is like kind of a magnet for us here. Your lived experience, Eddy, Sabrina, your lived experience, mine, everyone here's. And so that gives us this vision for Lunar Project or New Breath. But there are many folks who are looking and lacking visions. And that's also an opportunity for us to maybe offer them a beautiful vision that they can be part of too. And how do we make that like super irresistible and exciting is something that I think about.
Yeah, it's about just trying to focusing on the doing good, right? You know, I want to just take a couple of minutes to really say that I'm very proud to see, you know, Sabrina and Yi-Chen, you to just decided to say, this is what we're going to do, right? And then just do it. And yes, you're going to have many challenges, and yes, you're going to have trying to find your way in how to do it better. But you had a vision, and this is how you fulfill your vision, by learning and doing it at the same time, and with the support of community, right? And I think that's all we try to do. That we know that we can't do it by ourselves, and the more that we communicate, to build a relationship and deepen our relationship, the better as we move forward, you know, accomplishing what we want to accomplish, right? For me, it's always like, you know, there's so many fortuitous people just showing up in my life at different stages of it, right? And sometimes the least expected. And that's all because I'm staying focused in doing what I'm doing, right? Doing what I love to do, right? Which is to service the community, serve the people, right? And then so, and the little that I give, I receive the reward 100-fold more than I give out. That is a fact. And so as we move forward, you know, I look forward to part of as an individual and as New Breath Foundation, I want to continue to build with the Lunar Project and other, you know, people who really are investing in all of this, and so we can create this space together. And Errol, yes, you know, I'm going to be tapping onto you. You know, now you're exposed to more different projects and different things that people are doing. It's good. It's good to get back to our people, and you shouldn't be apologized for doing that.
Thank you, Eddy. Thank you for welcoming me.
Yes.
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming today and participating. Thank you, Eddy, for being with us and being in relationship and collaboration with Lunar Project as we grow and build into the vision that we have for it. For those of you who are a little bit newer to our work or would like to be added to our email list, I'm going to put our website in the chat, and you can feel free to check us out and sign up for our email list so we can send you information about future webinars like this. And we hope you will join us in our future programming, and hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
All right, take it easy, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
All right.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm going to stop recording. Hold on.